Well, good morning and good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the first panel of this day 3 of the National Workshop on Data Science Education. My name is Margot Boenig-Liptsin, and together with my colleague Ari Edmundson, who you should also be able to see among the people who have their screens on, we lead the Human Context and Ethics program at UC Berkeley. We call it HCE for short. We might be using that acronym a lot because it comes so naturally by now to us. We would like to begin, before we begin, a few housekeeping points. Please, when you join, mute your microphone and turn off your video so that we can focus on the panelists. And please, we'll do the bulk of the Q&A at the end of the panel. If you have a question during the panel that is really relevant to what a presenter is speaking about, please put it in the chat, and Ari and I will be moderating that. If we have a chance to get that question in, we will, but we'll save the bulk of the questions to a point kind of closer toward the end of the panel once we've heard the panelists share something with us that we can all wrestle and grapple with. We ask that all attendees respect one another and respect the panelists and the moderators. You might have seen the workshop code of conduct. We really value the participation of each member in the community and want to make sure that this is an enjoyable experience and fulfilling experience for everybody. So please show courtesy and respect. We'll aim for this panel to be around 90 minutes. Actually, we had intended on the whole 2 hours, so probably we'll go a little bit over, but just to give a buffer between the two panels that are happening this morning. So thank you very much, and let's get started. As you may have already seen from the videos that have been shared out about the UC Berkeley program, UC Berkeley Data Science Education Program, the human context and ethics of data is a foundational component of data science education at Berkeley. We really believe that data science education is incomplete without the young data scientists being trained to always inquire into the broader human worlds that the data they are working with comes from, and to know how to begin, how to start this kind of inquiry. We believe their education isn't complete without an understanding of the dreams and the worldviews that have shaped the statistical and computational techniques that they practice and learn and are learning. We believe they are really unprepared for their workplaces if they don't have an understanding of the particular form of power that data science wields in the world today. And if their data science education instead should also be preparing them to reflect upon their expertise as a data scientist, both the opportunities and limits of the profession, to make sense of these responsibilities and duties in communities of peers, of coworkers, and as part of broader democratic deliberation. Now, in order to achieve this, we believe that it's important for disciplines to work together. As educators, we need to work across disciplines, bringing humanities, social sciences, and STEM faculty to build unprecedented types of curriculum for the classroom and beyond the classroom, so that students can practice engaging issues at the intersection of technology and society, both conceptually and experience them personally in their own lives. So certainly this kind of, this vision of data science education that incorporates the human at the heart of what it is really an important piece of it has a particular urgency for UC Berkeley. We are a public institution committing to serving all of California's diverse populations, both through the kind of education that we give our students and through the worlds that our graduates help to build. And also, our university sits at the heart of San Francisco Bay Area and graduates a large number of students who go into the technical workforce of the Silicon Valley that end up shaping the lived reality of life here in the Bay Area and communities around the world. And so we know that we desperately need a more inclusive, participatory, convivial human technology futures here in the Bay. But of course, also, and this is where we come to our distinguished panel today, this is not a concern for only Berkeley, and the importance of the human and an institutional commitment to making this happen is not particular to UC Berkeley. How to teach the human dimensions of data science as part of technical education is a question that many universities, including probably yours from the audience, are grappling with and finding their own approaches to. And this is why we are really thrilled to have a panel of incredible teachers and partners, our own, I might say, teachers for Ari and myself, and partners for this work. Safiya Noble from UCLA, Rachel Thomas from University of USF, Aaron Fraenkel from UCSD, and Lise Getoor from UC Santa Cruz. So we look forward to talking together and learning from one another today about why, how, and what we teach about the human as part of data science education. And we're sure that we'll hear about a diversity of approaches, and also that we'll keep identifying a common core of what's important for data scientists to know and be able to do in the human world. So before I introduce, I actually invite Ari to introduce our first panelist. I would like to say a few more words about how we'll proceed in this panel. So we've asked the panelists to think about some questions in advance, and that will help us to learn about their experience teaching and get acquainted with their perspectives and methods. We'd like to devote about 45 minutes, an hour, to inviting the panelists to have this conversation among themselves and with Ari and myself as moderators. And we'll introduce each panelist before they give their opening remarks so that you can keep the introduction of the person close to when they speak. We'll also be keeping an eye on the questions. So again, if you have questions, you're welcome to add them to the chat. We might not be able to get to them in this more conversational piece at the beginning. We'll get to them in the Q&A in the last 30 minutes of the panel or so. And we'll aim to end 15 minutes early for sure, so that you can have a break and move on to the next panel. So with that, I hand it to Ari.
Okay. All right. So first, I'm just going to kind of give a brief introduction to the pair of questions that we pre-circulated with our panelists. So in one way or another, these were just the kind of very general prompts that we asked the panelists to reflect upon in their sort of opening and introductory remarks. So those are, the first one is, what terms do you use to describe what you contribute to data science and technical education? The term HCE context and ethics work for you? How does your choice of term and what to call this, how does that relate to what you want to highlight for yourselves and your students? So it's kind of first broad theme. And the other is, why do you teach about the human as part of the technical, especially data science education? So some things that we invited the panelists to consider are, why are human context and ethics issues important for students to know about and learn as part of their technical education? What's at stake broadly in HCE education? And we said, invited the panelists to talk about their motivation for creating specific courses or a specific piece of curriculum. So our plan first was to have Safiya Noble speak first. So I wanted to check, Safiya, did you make it back in successfully? Great.
I did.
Wonderful. Okay. So Safiya Noble, we're really excited to have you here. Safiya is an associate professor in the Department of Information Studies and Department of African American Studies at UCLA, and more recently is co-founder and co-director of the UCLA Center for Critical Internet Inquiry. She previously received her PhD in Library and Information Sciences from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Her academic research focuses on the design of digital media platforms and the ways in which those technologies transform and intersect with issues of race, gender, and culture. And in particular, she's been really a pioneer in bringing critical approaches of Black feminism and intersectional analysis to the study of algorithms. Safiya is the author of the best-selling book, Algorithms of Oppression: How Search Engines Reinforce Racism, 2018, which is really one of the first books to comprehensively examine how structural racism and sexism intertwine with the political economy of digital media in the discriminatory design and everyday operation of algorithmic systems. So here in the HCE program at Berkeley, we've been really inspired since day one by Safiya's work and have used it to make sense of how race is encoded into digital platforms, and have used it to help our students see this too. So why we're so lucky to have Safiya with us today, and look forward to learning about how she teaches her own students.
Thank you so much. That's such a lovely introduction, and I'm really grateful to have an opportunity to meet you all and to talk for a few minutes today. So with that, let me just say that it's really amazing to get to participate in conversations like this right now, not only because we're in a global movement that's focused on racial justice in the United States and reimagining the distribution of resources toward social equality and racial equality. So it's timely for us to be having these conversations because about a decade ago, when I was thinking about the way in which I was documenting and witnessing racial encoding, the encoding of racist values and sexism into digital media platforms. In particular, I was focused on Google, but of course, I've also written about Yelp. I look at Facebook and other platforms. 10 years ago, when I alleged that digital technologies could discriminate, I was met with a resounding no, impossible, especially from my colleagues in engineering and computer science, but also certainly people in certain quarters of information science who, at the time, strongly believed that computer science could not discriminate because at the end of the day, it's just math and math can't be racist. And this was a prevailing logic. And it's so unbelievable to think that 10 years later, after what felt like an impossible feat to find 4 people to sit on a dissertation committee and approve my work, that now, the National Science Foundation and my colleagues at Berkeley have organized this incredible meeting. So I just want to say that I'm really humbled to get to participate and to see all of your work that is so much more impactful in bringing to the foreground the, the ethical, moral, political import of the digital, let's say, broadly speaking. So at UCLA, I have spent, first of all, I hold an appointment in information studies, African American studies, gender studies, and education. And part of the reason why I hold multiple appointments is because I think that our work is so interdisciplinary. And one of the things that I can do to make my work more legible in multiple fields is to simply hold appointments in those departments and allow myself to participate in the culture of those departments and to be known and to attract students from many different kinds of disciplinary backgrounds. I certainly find a lot of engineering and computer science students in my classes at UCLA, and they're always borderline traumatized when they learn that there are so many political, ethical, moral dimensions of their work, and they're surprised that they've been through 4 years of computer science education at UCLA and haven't had space to talk about these important issues that you all are going to be talking about today. One of the things that I have tried to do there in collaboration with my colleague, Sarah Roberts, who some of you might know, has really brought to the fore the issue of content moderation. Again, 10 years ago, I remember we went to grad school together. This is one of the reasons why you see us goofing off together on Twitter a lot. It's because we've known each other for a long time. And when we were starting our work, my work around kind of the values embedded in AI and algorithms, and for her, looking at the hidden laborers and the people who do what we think of as kind of the dirty work of moderating content, who are exposed to incredibly traumatic content and who are deeply harmed. One of the things she discovered in her work was that that work is primarily outsourced around the world in kind of former sites of colonial power and U.S. imperial power, the Philippines, India, other places. And we also found, through her work that many content moderators, people adjudicating the worst in digital platforms, are people of color here in the United States, African Americans and Latinos. People who are, again, considered the disposable human beings, the true humans that are in many ways trading their well-being and in some cases their lives because of the onset of physical trauma to the body from the mental exposures and emotional exposures. So we kind of, the two of us joined forces at UCLA to kind of co-found this UCLA Center. And one of the reasons we use the word critical around our work, probably even more so than we use the word ethics, is because we are trying to invoke a whole series of critical theories. And what we're really asking our students to do is to have a power analysis in their studies of the digital and of data science more broadly. What that allows for are feminist critiques of technology. Of course, we were really deeply influenced by people like Judy Wayman, Wendy Chun. I mean, these are the Alondra Nelson, Anna Everett. These are people that we read when we were students, who I think of as the kind of the giants upon whose shoulders we stand. We wanted to allow space for, again, political economy, critical race theory, critical kind of intersectional feminist approaches to studying digital technologies, not just as ephemeral, which was the way we were taught about them, but, and maybe let's say push back on, but thinking about all of these technologies as being deeply tied to, public policy, foreign policy, economic trade issues, really always trying to foreground the material dimensions of the internet and of digital technologies. So, who does the mining for the devices, who does the e-waste labor of picking apart devices, who does the manufacturing, who does the adjudication and labor, and who are the software engineers and others, hardware engineers, physicists, who applied mathematicians who make code and software. So, really trying to look broadly at the ecosystem is what we do in our work, both as researchers, but also as teachers. So I teach a course called Information and Power at UCLA, which is kind of a GE course, and it's exactly what you can imagine. Also always trying to kind of bring in analog technologies to compare and contrast for our students. What does it mean to be deeply immersed in a search engine as a source of so-called knowledge? And then what does it mean? How do you contrast that with a library or a museum or a university, quite frankly? We have been challenged, I would say, by frameworks of data ethics that we started to see emerge. One of the challenges there is that, by my reckoning, many of the ways that we know what we know about the ethical, social, moral, political dimensions of technology has been the work of women of color scholars and journalists, LGBTQ scholars and journalists, activists and community-based organizations. And what we've noticed is that over the last decade, a lot of our work has kind of been moved to the back, while a new class of data ethicists have moved to the front of the line, so to speak, or the room, to the mic. Many of them are former tech evangelists who now are reformed and tech ethicists. And what we've noticed is how, to the degree to which they have shifted the discourse back to technocentric, techno-deterministic possibilities. So these are the same kind of institutions and people who have kind of defanged and depoliticized the critical approaches, humanistic and social science inquiries about what we're talking about today. So this is a place where we're focusing our next 5 years of energy at the center on, again, trying to recuperate and keeps at the center the most vulnerable. We find that when we talk about those who are most vulnerable, most likely to be negatively affected or have disparate impact from AI algorithms, platforms, weak governance, weak regulation, those people have very little voice and and are not put at the center of our framing. So that's one of the things that we do and really try to focus. And I think we think of ourselves as a bit of an outlier at UCLA in trying to be at a public school and do that kind of work, which, as you can imagine, is not deeply funded. Having said that, we have a new provost at UCLA, and maybe I'll just try to wrap here and say that our dean of the division of college, our dean in the college in the division of social sciences, Darnell Hunt, has a new big data and society initiative. And so all of the social science departments, from statistics to econ, gender studies, where I hold an appointment, African American studies, many of us are working in similar fashion to many of you about trying to raise up different paradigms. We have a new data social science degree that's coming on board. That'll probably be a 3+1 or a 4+1. We're working on that now, so that students who might get their undergraduate degree in African American studies could stay on for one more year and get this kind of data science, data social science master's. And this would be for people who, for example, want to go and work in community-based organizations and want to be able to resist the kind of the weaponization of data against their communities, so that people who can be super astute about the political ramifications. So these might be political scientists, all kinds of people who want to push back and reframe. And so they have the kind of proper core competencies and literacies to do that. So we're really upfront that that's what we think is energizing about our approach. Our provost, as I mentioned, is brand new, Emily Carter, Dr. Emily Carter. She has a brand new initiative called Data X. I guess the X meaning fill in the blank, data plus whoever you are and whatever your approaches are. And so she has put out a call for papers across the whole campus. Every department practically is participating in one way or another in trying to frame up data science relative to their fields or their sets of concerns or their imperatives. And so in the Department of Information Studies, which has kind of long been known as a social justice kind of oriented information studies program in the United States, we're thinking about an undergraduate degree, again, centering these ethical dimensions of technology and data science. Certainly not everybody does that kind of work at UCLA, but I'm not here to talk about that. I'm here to talk about what we're doing that I think it really aligns with this workshop. And so maybe I'll just leave it there and invite questions and the conversation. And again, I'm just thrilled to be here in conversation with the rest of the panelists too.
Safiya, thank you very much. You're always so articulate, so clearly articulate about, putting things where they are, naming them. Really appreciate that. And it's incredible to hear about the various things that are happening at UCLA, especially in light of a history that you describe, recent history, where even the topics were not recognized as. So there's so much that you've already given us to think about, and we'd like to layer on that and combine it with the perspectives that others will share with us, and then come back to so many things. So I would like to invite Lise to, first introduce Lise Getoor. Lise Getoor is a professor of computer science at UC Santa Cruz, where she's also the director of the Santa Cruz D3 Data Science Research Center, and has taught a course called Responsible Data Science, among many other courses, into which she always brings in concern about the human, the social. Lisa's research is centered on machine learning and reasoning under uncertainty, and she is involved in numerous academic organizations and has served on boards of journals devoted to machine learning and artificial intelligence. And I find that personally, Lise is really unique in her willingness as a computer scientist to think together with social scientists and humanists about foundational conceptual underpinnings of computing and data science. For example, optimization and uncertainty. And she brings this interest and openness and reading and talking collectively across disciplines to her teaching. And this past winter, she did a course on artificial intelligence where she put ethics and thinking about power at the center of her teaching. So Lisa, with really pleased to have you join the panel and looking forward to what you can share with us.
Okay, awesome. Thanks for the very nice introduction. And I just want to make sure you can hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah. And you can see my slide okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Yes, we can. Okay. So I want to start with an introduction, and I'm going to give more of an introduction than I normally would in any talk, just to say where I'm coming from. And, you know, thanks, Margot, very much for the plug. And I'm very interested in engaging across these boundaries. But just from a CS perspective, I'm a professor in the computer science department at UC Santa Cruz. I used to be a professor at University of Maryland. You know, I'm a fellow of the ACM, Association in Computing Machinery, AAAI. And from a research perspective, my main interest is in statistical relational learning, which is something that does mixes probabilistic reasoning with relational reasoning. So think social networks, other kinds of networks and graphs. And the main tool that my group, the Hammer, is something called probabilistic soft logic, open source toolkit. You know, I could totally geek out and tell you about how scalable it is and all these things. We've applied it to all kinds of cool things like recommender systems, engagement modeling, reasoning about environmental impacts and human trafficking and more. So that's my CS hat. My data science hat, I have been involved, like I'm sure you know all of you have, in many efforts. The ones worth mentioning are I was on the National Science Academy roundtable on teaching data science. I participated in a bunch of NSF workshops on data science education, in particular teaching data science ethics. I'm also PI on NSF Tripod's Transdisciplinary Foundations of Data Science. And that's kind of different because it's more about kind of theoretical foundations. What are the kind of theoretical limits of data science? What are the new things we need? And like Margot said, I'm director of this Data Science Research Center, which is very much about industrial collaborations. But as Safiya mentioned, I'm one of those technologists that has kind of come over to the side of jumping on the bandwagon of, you know, I call it either responsible data science, or my undergrad class is called ethics and algorithms. And, you know, where did I come to this from? I came to it as part of a frustration around what I felt was a complete overselling of capabilities in machine learning, AI, and data science. You know, unpacking these terms, intelligent, machine learning, and so on, and not thinking critically now from a data science foundations perspective of just the limits of the algorithms. And also a real fear of how the technology could then be applied. Think, you know, weapons of mass destruction, Cathy O'Neil, think all of the wonderful examples of Safiya mentioned, of course, and her own work as, you know, highlighting some of the potential issues. So as part of this, I've been in all these conversations where you have kind of technologists and humanists having conversations, and I really feel like they're often talking past each other. I think it's getting better. I think there's lots of interesting reasons why it's getting better, but just to kind of caricature, I think there's often this, that technologists are talking to the, I'll say humanists, I don't know if that's the appropriate term, but broadly, that they'll say like, well, you know, just tell us what to optimize. If you just explain it to us, we'll tell you what to optimize. And one of the times that this kind of really came to the forefront was the Simons Institute at Berkeley. It was actually a year ago, had a really interesting workshop, you know, wrong at the root, racial bias and the tension between numbers and words in non-internet data. And, you know, so the title's, you know, exactly the right thing, and there were a ton of really awesome speakers, you know, maybe some in the audience as well. But in some of the conversations the interesting thing is, you know, Simons Institute is very much, you know, it's not machine learning people and AI people, it's theoretical computer scientists. So they're within computer science at kind of one extreme. And that saying, you know, this is great, we understand. Now, if you just tell us how to translate that into math. And so there was this fundamental not getting of some of the complexity and context. On the other hand, I've also been in these conversations where I'm the token engineer, and I'm kind of written off as like engineers just want to fix things. And while I understand, maybe not as deeply as I should, some of the things coming behind that in terms of assumptions about power, coloniality, and more. On the other hand, as an engineer, it's like, yes, I'm a positive. As I want to make the world a better place. You know, what's wrong with fixing things? You know, what are you supposed to do? Break things? So that's another kind of conversation I've heard. So I actually teach two classes. So one is a undergrad class that's ethics and algorithms, and one is a graduate course called responsible data science. And admittedly, the ethics and algorithms class, I really wanted to teach a GE class or at least a lower division class. But my department chair told me, well, we need seats in upper division computer science classes. You have to teach it as an upper division computer science class. So even though that wasn't my original vision, that's what I did. And that's probably the one I'll talk about most. I taught that in winter quarter. And then I taught the graduate responsible data science in just finished a week ago, thank God. And one of the big things I want to get across to the students is you don't take a machine learning black box and an ethics black box and call that ethics or responsible data science. And I do think that there are certain framings around ethical data science. Maybe these are the ones that Safiya was talking about that have this approach and that it's problematic. So I try and get that across. One of the things that I think you'd be interested to appreciate is that I do use the term socio-technical systems a fair bit, and coming from the science, technology, and society community. And this is a concept that I think is actually relatively, easy is maybe too strong, but the technologists, the computer scientists are comfortable with. And, you know, it's not the framing that they're used to. They're used to just like straight optimization, very individualistic. But then when you say, oh, you know, there's these ways in which things interact at multiple levels of abstractions, you know, computer scientists all love abstractions, so talk abstractions, I like it. And, you know, if you think of the field of computer science, you know, human-computer interaction, there are places where, you know, not at the same level as socio-technical systems, but it's not completely foreign to them. So this is something that I think is very useful and accessible. The other thing that I try and teach is about, you know, the issue with, at the heart, data science is around optimization problems, and trying to say that, okay, all optimization problems are abstractions, none of them are correct, and then try and get into all of these issues about context in data, labels, all of the issues, you know, yeah, we can have a long side discussion on that, and loss function. So this is, you know, staying kind of a little bit in their comfort zone of optimization, but then trying to say, okay, you know, what are the issues with it? The other topic that, like Safiya said, when they first hear it, they're kind of freaked out by, but they get it once it's explained at some level, is this notion of algorithmic discrimination. And so I found that this topic, while new, was something that they could experience or could relate to. Still, there's a real challenge with translation. And, you know, I experienced this. I was lucky enough, maybe, I think it was 2 years ago, I was visiting Microsoft Research New York City in their Fairness, Accountability, Transparency, and Ethics group. Fortunate enough to be there. I thought that was a really interesting group in that it had kind of really solid social scientists and humanists together with really hardcore machine learning people, very patiently, week after week, trying to unpack the language. But just so that you are aware, there is this whole, this is how I feel. There's these icebergs of meaning that are behind certain terms that are commonly used in around critical studies that are just, the technologists don't understand them. I mean, I feel like I'm just starting to understand them. For example, you know, power. Okay, now admittedly, part of the reason, a little known fact about me is in between the time that I got my master's in computer science and my PhD in computer science, I seriously thought about going back and studying, you know, anthropology, feminist theory, and so on. And, you know, my knowledge is completely dated because that was like bazillion years ago. But to me, some of the concepts are not completely foreign. So you know, I'm still learning, and I'm very much still learning how to translate them to for, you know, junior and senior computer science undergrads. But just being aware that these are new concepts, and even justice, like I still remember when Jenny Reardon, the director of the UC Santa Cruz Science and Justice program, I first met her when I came to Santa Cruz like 5 years ago, and she was like, justice, and I was like, oh, justice, you know, justice sounds good, but not fully appreciating like all of the ways in which to unpack that. And so I think the students are open, they just don't know these things. And autonomy, like they're so used to thinking about autonomous vehicles, they're not used to thinking about human autonomy. And structural racism. So I mean, I just taught it winter quarter, and I had to explain structural racism, and I'm sure I did a terrible job, but I explained it, and that was a new thing for a lot of the students. And I'm teaching it again in the fall. It's amazing between winter and this fall, you know, what the difference is. So this is a fast moving area. And I want to close by stealing a slide from Margot. So I was lucky enough to have Margot come give a guest lecture in the ethics and algorithms class. And she had presented this definition of ethics. And then she asked this provocative question, you know, how do we aim at the good life with algorithms? And part of what I think there's a need to figure out how to have the conversation around, we can think of socio-technical systems where we can think of kind of dystopian socio-technical systems that automate bias, that surveil us and, you know, make us angry and unhappy. Or we can think of these kind of more kind of utopian socio-technical systems that support collaboration, collective action, you know, make the world a better place. And obviously these two are caricatures, but it's like, what will we aim for, and what are the tools we need to even understand what these mean? And trying to think about, okay, how do we have the conversation, have the bridging language, and engage students to do this? So, thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Lisa. That was a really wonderful presentation that, like, yeah, jives so well with the things that we do and think about. Up next, we have Rachel. And so Rachel is a computer scientist.
I'm not hearing what Ari's saying. Are other people?
Oh, am I coming through?
I can hear you.
Okay, all right. So Rachel is a computer scientist and founding director of the Center for Applied Data Ethics at the University of San Francisco. Her PhD is in mathematics, and her academic research in particular is in the field of networks. She's applied her computer.
So I guess my speakers aren't working.
She's applied her computing.
I will do some device debugging.
Expertise in industry to problems as diverse as energy trading and driving interface design. Rachel embodies a computing professional who is always observant of the broader cultures and institutions of the computing profession, and has used her expertise to shape it in ways that help to include and pave the way for others. For example, she developed the first university-accredited open access certificate in deep learning called Practical Deep Learning for Coders, and co-founded Fast.ai, a nonprofit research group focused on democratizing deep learning. Rachel's leadership in teaching at USF and beyond inspires public awareness and discussion of the critical issues of inclusion and diversity in the field of AI. So thank you, Rachel, for joining us, and we're really looking forward to hearing your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me. So I'm going to share my screen to share some slides. See, and so hopefully those are visible now. Yeah, so I'm going to give a little bit of background just about the Center for Applied Data Ethics at USF to start. So we're part of the USF Data Institute, which is located in downtown San Francisco near the Embarcadero BART station. We're working remotely right now, of course, but we hope you'll visit when it's safe to do so. And we have three key initiatives, and the one I focus on is our Center for Applied Data Ethics, but we also have initiatives on the environment and human rights, as well as AI and medical research. And the Data Institute's home to a Masters of Data Science program that started in 2012. This is one of the earlier ones in the country. It's highly selective, and it's a one-year in-person program. And something that's neat about it is the students all do an 8-month-long part-time internship as part of the program, and that's something that we set up at the Data Institute. And as a result, we have partnerships with a number of local companies and nonprofits. I should also note we have added a required ethics of data science course to the MSDS program, and I taught that this year, which I'll be saying more about in a moment. And then we have offerings for the broader community, including evening courses. I taught a Intro to Data Ethics evening course, which I'll talk about, but we get a really wide variety of participants in those since they're kind of open to everyone. And then we have lunchtime seminars. I organized a tech policy workshop this year, so a number of other events. And our mission with the center is to really focus on harms that are happening now to real people with an applied practical focus. And so we're kind of less interested in, speculative harms of what might happen in 10 or 20 years, but really kind of what's already going wrong, and what are the kind of more applied or practical things we can try to do to address these harms. And our focus thus far has largely been on disinformation, surveillance, and algorithmic bias. So I wanted, when I set about to teach courses on this, I did try to do a lot of other research on existing courses, and I found in particular Casey Fiesler's work very helpful. Casey's a professor at the University of Colorado, and she created a crowdsourced spreadsheet of tech ethics syllabi, kind of from across the country of how these topics are being taught in a wide variety of programs. And then she did a meta-analysis on the syllabi. And this is an interesting paper because it highlights, I think, a lot of the ongoing debates or discussions happening in this area of kind of how to teach this. Should ethics be a standalone course versus worked into every course in a computer science program? Who should teach it? Should it be a computer scientist or a philosopher or a sociologist? And she found of the syllabi she collected a huge amount of variety in where the course was housed, where the instructor was from, which department, because as I think both Safiya and Lise noted, these are really complex interdisciplinary problems that are drawing heavily from the social sciences and humanities. What topics to cover in the course. I think this is the area where there is a huge amount of variety because there are so many different potential topics that can be covered and that are really important, including inequality, justice, human rights, privacy, surveillance, civic responsibility, professional ethics, work and labor, design, cybersecurity, and it's much more than could fit in any one course. And what learning outcomes? And this is an area where there was probably kind of the most agreement in that many of us, including myself, are trying to teach skills around critique, how to even spot issues when considering a new technology or application, how to make arguments and how to communicate about these. So that's definitely a hope I have for students in the course of kind of building these skills. So in the course, I talk a lot about things, I say recent events, but things that have happened in the last 5 to 10 years, and a few specific examples. This is an algorithm that was implemented in Arkansas to determine people's healthcare benefits, and there was a bug in it, and it incorrectly cut needed healthcare to people that really needed it. And this is kind of an example of how people are suffering as a result of what can go wrong. And that was also an instance where kind of nobody was willing to take responsibility. Everyone was kind of passing the buck about who should have been responsible. This is from LaTanya Sweeney's original research on racism and online ad delivery, which continues to be an ongoing problem. And this was around if you Google an African, and I know Safiya Noble's done work on this as well. If you Google an African American name, getting ads suggesting that the person has a criminal record, even when they don't. We have a lot of global events, including Facebook's role in the genocide in Myanmar. And then as well in the US, this is an article from Baltimore, where after or during the Freddie Gray protests, so this was a Black man who was murdered by police, police used facial recognition to identify protesters, which I think is deeply, deeply disturbing. And this occurred in 2015. So these are examples of kind of some of the topics that we talk about, and also why I think these are kind of some of the most crucial things we can be working on right now. So I taught 2 courses this year. One was an evening course, not part of a degree, and there I had a really interesting mix of people working as software engineers, but also people that work in healthcare with healthcare data, grad students from different programs around the Bay Area. I had people that work in trust and safety, at nonprofits, and so that made for some very, very interesting discussions. That was really fantastic. And then in the Masters of Data Science, we have a required course for all the students in the program. I used a similar curriculum for both. It was kind of a survey, and hoping to teach some of these skills of critique through the topics of disinformation, bias, surveillance, algorithmic colonialism, also our ecosystem in the tech industry of metrics and venture capital and hypergrowth, and what sort of outcomes these things incentivize and often lead to, as well as foundation of ethics and workplace tools that hopefully can be helpful for students to implement in the workplace. The course is a mix of lecture and discussion. It does involve a lot of reading. I'm just going to list just a few of the readings to give a taste of it that students particularly enjoyed. I have several academic papers. One of my favorite papers, and that students really loved as well, is Data Sheets for Data Sets by Timnit Gebru et al. And this is kind of accepting, all data is biased, and there's so many decisions and factors that go into how you build a data set, and just the importance of being explicit about what those are and trying to standardize that of, how this data was collected, what's missing from it, who collected it, how is it being maintained. And something else I love about this paper is it does a kind of a case study, a history of how standardization and regulation came to three other industries, because I think we can learn a lot from that. I try to pull from a kind of an interdisciplinary body of work. A paper by a law professor that students enjoyed is "The Platform is the Message" by James Grimmelman, which does a kind of an in-depth analysis of the Tide Pod Challenge meme, but also looks at how the platforms are really structurally at war with themselves in many ways, because the same factors that cause content to go viral and be popular often are what reward incendiary and offensive and objectionable content. I love the resources from the Markula Center on Tech Ethics, particularly Shannon Baller's Ethical Toolkit for Engineering Design and Practice. And this is, kind of recommended practices to implement in the workplace for more proactively looking for ethical issues and including widening the ethical circle to include a broader group of people. I think those are helpful. I assigned a number of articles that academics have written kind of for more popular audiences. One that led to really engaging discussion was Zeynep Tufekci's "The Real Reason Fans Hate the Last Season of Game of Thrones," which she wrote for Scientific American. And then she makes this distinction between sociological storytelling and psychological storytelling. And she ties this in with the tech industry, that our culture often focuses on psychological storytelling of, like, what is Mark Zuckerberg's psyche? Like, what can we understand about him? What makes him tick? And we don't focus enough on the sociological factors of kind of what does it mean to be in this environment with very few regulations, where, these are the economic incentives, and to kind of look at those sociological factors. And she gives Game of Thrones and The Wired as 2 TV shows which focused a lot more on sociological storytelling. So that led to some great discussion. I really like Abiba Burhane's The Algorithmic Colonization of Africa, kind of looking at the issues of when you have companies kind of based in one country treating people in other country just as raw materials to be mined and not as kind of human beings with their own agency. Another great paper that led to a lot of good discussion was Alvaro Bedoya's Privacy as a Civil Right. And this includes hundreds of years of history, looking at how surveillance has been used even long before computers, but how surveillance is a tool to monitor marginalized people and to kind of try to suppress them when they push for social change and for justice. So that's just kind of a sample of some of the readings. So this is what's one thing you'll do in response to the course. These are certainly cherry-picked answers. I'm going to share a few, but this is something that the types of things that I hope students will get from the course. Many students have said that just even taking the course can open up the opportunity to talk about these topics with their friends and coworkers and fellow students, which can be useful. One student said that they were going to be more deliberate in what jobs they take, and they feel more comfortable rejecting work that does not align with their values, which I think is fantastic. And yeah, I would love to see more students feeling that way and asking those questions. I had someone who works in venture capital take the evening course and said it's changed what kind of questions they're asking before they make investments. A student who works as a kind of privacy engineer is going to incorporate more work on issues such as bias and disinformation. And then someone said, this course helped me to start formulating thoughts and questions, which is a great outcome as well, of just to even be able to kind of know what questions to be asking on these topics. Some of the challenges of teaching these topics. And so, and this has been noted in the two previous talks, some students with primarily math and computer science and statistics backgrounds, and this is the background I'm coming from, can be very uncomfortable with these more open-ended inquiries and looking at these really, really complex interdisciplinary problems. And there's often an interest in purely technical solutions, which is not the way to go and is not going to work. But that can that can be a challenge. I've had students ask for, kind of, I want you to give me the algorithm to remove bias, and it's, just even getting them to the point of understanding that is not how it works. And then I think there's often this discomfort with kind of people just wanting a solution now, whereas I do think we really just need to spend time, particularly those of us coming from math backgrounds, of understanding the problems and learning more. And that's not to say there's nothing we can be doing now, but that these are very complex kind of social problems. I've kind of wondered about depth versus breadth in the case studies I cover, and what the right balance on that is. This is a reading heavy course, and I think that's more difficult for students who are less fluent in English. We do have a significant number of international students at USF, and so this is something I'm still thinking about. And then my experience this year has been really colored by having to switch to virtual during the pandemic. So the kind of the master's course was starting in mid-March, and so that was when we were kind of having to go online in a rush. And in particular, I think these are topics that really benefit from being able to have a discussion, and particularly in-person discussion. And so I still am wanting to grow my skills in how I teach them online. And then I was just going to close with a quote from Julia Angwin that I find kind of inspiring and helpful. And Julia Angwin is the chief editor of The Markup, and previously was a senior journalist at ProPublica, but has done a lot of investigative journalism into kind of ethics issues in tech. And she said, I strongly believe that in order to solve a problem, you have to diagnose it, and that we're still in the diagnosis phase of this. If you think about the turn of the century and industrialization, we had 30 years of child labor, unlimited work hours, terrible working conditions, and it took a lot of journalist muckraking and advocacy to diagnose the problem and then have some understanding of what it was, and then the activism to get the laws changed. I see my role as trying to make as clear as possible what the downsides are and diagnosing them really accurately so that they can be solvable. That's hard work, and lots more people need to be doing it. And I found that that kind of inspiring and helpful. And while Julia is a journalist, and I'm kind of coming from the data science perspective, but of the time spent trying to accurately diagnose and understand these issues is kind of valuable and necessary. So that's all I have. I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Rachel, thank you very much. Thank you for highlighting this necessity to make the problems at first visible and help others grapple with how to see them and then think about what kind of action is possible individually and collective in order to address them. Thank you, and there's so much, again, as in every talk, to return to. And before we do, we have one more presenter, and this is from Aaron Fraenkel. Aaron is an assistant teaching professor at University of UC San Diego, and he teaches and develops curriculum for UCSD's data science program there. He's also a really long-term participant, as I understand, of the national workshops on data science education. So it's wonderful to have someone who's so invested in the project at UCSD and beyond. Aaron's research is about studying the human role, the role humans and bots play in online abuse. His PhD is in mathematics. And before coming to UCSD, he worked as a senior scientist in industry, including at Amazon. His interest in teaching the next generation of data scientists stems in part from this experience of working as a data scientist in the real world, concerned with, someone who watches and is attentive to issues of cybersecurity, anti-fraud, and anti-abuse in industry. We're looking forward to learning more about how this experience and his educational background informs his approach to teaching the human and social dimensions of data science. Thank you, Aaron.
Thank you, Margot. And I guess this is the time frame that we measure by in tech and data science. So I participated last year in this workshop, and I guess that's a long-term contributor. But I hope it definitely. I got a lot out of it last year, and I hope to in the future as well. So. I really wanted to actually talk and give an introduction to my perspective through where I came from and what brought me here, and in this introduction, as opposed to my current courses that I'm teaching. So why I teach about the human, it really is informed from my experience as a data scientist before coming to UCSD. So as Margot mentioned, I worked in fraud, abuse, cybersecurity in industry, and I had early in my career as a data scientist, I had a particular task that I worked on, which was working with the CFPB, the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau, to develop regulations on disparate impact for fraud detection models. So these are developed and codified in law for lending models, but fraud and algorithmic fraud detection models were sort of a new thing in this area. And what I noticed was that even in this relatively straightforward scenario, right, regulated scenario, data scientists still have a lot of small decisions that you have to make in order to conform and implement, these sorts of conform to these regulations. And so you still have to play an active role in identifying adverse social consequences in your work. And what I really noticed was that even those who are really capable about reasoning about these socio-technological structures, complex social issues, they still struggle to identify and isolate potential issues in their models, right? And identify these issues and structures in their quantitative work. Too often, as Rachel mentioned, as well as Lisa, that data scientists just want to apply formula and be done with it, right? They just want to be told what to do. And this really will never be sufficient. And the big difference between, old-fashioned lending regulations, for example, on regulating guidelines and algorithms, which is something that was, for example, talked about by Cathy O'Neill in Weapons of Math Destruction, is that algorithms, they really have the potential to run unchecked and unexamined once shipped into production. And data scientists are really the primary auditors for this sort of decision-making at scale. And I noticed that many of my coworkers were sort of ill-equipped and didn't really have the toolkit to be able to reason about these sorts of social structures in this way in their data. So I think the way that I at least deconstruct some of this, as a working data scientist, is that if you want to productively confront something like, the violations of someone's rights in a data science product or project, it would involve sort of 3 different tasks, right? You have to be able to reason about these social circumstances around those rights and the need for them. You need to be able to identify the violation in your data, and then you need to think about approaching a repair and remedy of this violation. And coming back into an educational setting and teaching undergraduates who are going to go out into the workforce and be confronted with situations like this, my focus has really been to give students the experience at connecting those first 2 tasks. So that connection between reasoning about these social circumstances and identifying that violation in your data, right? So I hope and assume, right, that students get in their education courses that are really focused on teaching students how to reason about these social circumstances, but really students don't really get the opportunity to really see it and work with these circumstances in the data as they would be in the workplace. So I want students to have the ability to start that conversation at work and ask, I think something is wrong here, right? And why do I want them to be able to start that conversation? Because real projects and products, right, they're the sum of many small decisions and observations. And this auditing by sort of frontline data scientists in these cases, on a day-to-day basis, is really important to sort of, as you sort of drift, a larger work forward. And I really think, so many of, tech people want to do good. Many of them want to do good. And I think that issues that are raised early and often will sort of lead to less resistance, right? To try to rectify or air these issues. So in classes, so in my courses, I really try to focus on, I would say, critically reasoning about the processes and structures that generate the data being analyzed, and I really identifying those in the data. And so I do this in, I've taught 4 courses at UCSD where HCE HCE has appeared, and I try to sort of, it's not necessarily an HC course, or it isn't. I try to sort of inject this in as many of my courses and technical courses as possible. But I've taught it in 4 courses, from freshman seminar with no prerequisites to senior upper level courses. And the sort of theme behind them is, all of these, is that they focus on sort of the data science life cycle and identifying these social structures at various points in a full holistic, data science project. Thanks.
Great, thanks everyone. So I think maybe as a first place to just start to begin a follow-up on these wonderful presentations is to maybe invite all of you to sort of add anything you feel like sharing about, and some of you have more or less, but say a little more about teaching strategies in some of these courses, perhaps. So there's been a lot of talk already about like learning objectives, learning outcomes, and readings. But I want to sort of invite you all to say a little bit more about other kinds of teaching strategies, just the shape of the classroom. How do you involve discussion versus lecture and balance that? Challenges around that kind of how you structure the environment, how this class scales to different at different sizes, or if you've had certain challenges moving it online. And then we'll kind of wait and see if we'll get some more questions from the audience too to come in to supplement that. Anything you'd like to add, Margot?
I think that's a great place to start.
I'm happy to jump in and echo Rachel's comment of, I felt like I had just barely started to figure out how to get it to work in the in-person setting. And now going to virtual is a particular challenge, I think, in this area. So I'm very interested to hear about people's strategies. I found it was important to do small breakout groups in the in-person setting. I went to online for the graduate course, which had a different dynamic, and it felt like at the beginning of the quarter, I could achieve in, breakout rooms a reasonable amount of kind of discussion, but then by the end of the quarter, everybody had gotten kind of Zoom fatigue and so on. And so it's an issue. I'm curious to get some answers from the other panelists or audience on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think something that came up. So I was teaching 80 students in one online course. Yeah, that was certainly not ideal. But the students, I didn't realize this at first. It was like a 2-hour course, so I take a break in the middle. But many of them were staying on the Zoom call and having discussion out loud. And that's something, I've been allowing sometimes for class discussions, but I think they were actually talking more when I stepped away for the break. And they even asked, like, can we have more of this? And so there were some really interesting discussions that way. And it was tough. I mean, with 80 people, I thought like that's kind of too much to have everyone just talking. And clearly not everybody was talking, maybe like 10 people. I think I'm also just struggling with kind of some time constraints. If I do think this course would be best in much smaller groups, but just then kind of, having the time to offer more sections. So I think there is some tension maybe around kind of like resource constraints there.
This last quarter, actually, I was leading, so it was this for a smaller class, but I was leading a capstone domain with the way that we've scaled our capstone is you lead sort of a general subject area with about 20 people. And one of our 20 students in one of our domains, the domains I was leading was one on racial bias in policing, and particularly predictive policing algorithms. And what I found, so I had great success with breakout rooms, and it required, more organization than I usually have. But I really assigned a lot of very, very low stakes writing assignments, just write a few paragraphs here. But that really helped seed conversations. And then I would just randomly populate, the breakout rooms of 3. And I think because I was not in there, actually, often we would have, where I would have trouble getting like discussion in the larger group, it would, very like lively, productive conversation seemed to happen. And actually, and then the way that I know that is that they then have to write sort of a summary, right, of how their conversation went, and they had a few bullet points, that they had to go through, like what, where was sort of the most disagreement, where was the most agreement, questions like this, and really I was so pleasantly surprised that I'm going to try my best to implement it in classroom, right, when we move back.
Yeah, I'll add just to say a bit different in terms of thinking about the makeup of my syllabus. I'm extremely conscientious about making sure there's kind of an overrepresentation of women, women of color, people of color, LGBTQ, gender non-binary voices who are writing in the field, because again, I think these are people who are less likely often to get picked up these days in the data ethics, especially in the ethics dimension. There was, I can't remember, East Coast school that was dragged pretty hard on the internet for their data philosophy, data ethics course that was pretty much all white male philosophers from the Enlightenment as the framework for ethics. And, so I'm, attuned to the way in which, again, centering voices and scholars who are, again, often, I think, marginalized or cut out of their own critiques. So that's one thing that I think has been helpful. The other things is I try to do a lot of scaffolding up into the conversations. So I assume that students know nothing about society. And of course, I always kick my classes off with the technical students kind of reminding them that they have no business designing technologies for society and they know nothing about society. So, that means we have to kind of orient them around what is neoliberalism. So they read, David Harvey, A Brief History of Neoliberalism. We read Bell Hooks, Engaged Pedagogy, and I orient them to understanding that they are active makers of their own education, that this is not a kind of one-way consumptive relationship between me and them, and that we're doing the vulnerable work of becoming educated together. So a lot of what I do in the first kind of, let's say, third of the class is orienting and framing them into the conversations so that by the time we get to the middle of the class, they feel like they have some vocabulary words around critical race theory, feminist theories of technology, social, political, economic, kind of historical contexts in which to understand the social construction of information, the social construction of technology. We just kind of do that type of scaffolding so that everybody can participate equally. Because that's one of the things that I've learned is that my students who come in, for example, who are Chicano Latino studies minors, are ready to go with the social and theoretical kinds of critique. And that silences my students who aren't as comfortable. So really always regrounding back to the readings from this class so that everybody's on the same footing. I think that's a way to powerfully support students. And then, of course, I also do a lot of framing about that some of you will be leaders and some of you will be learners in different moments, so that my students who have more of an engineering or technical background can be leaders in the conversation later when we're trying to talk about the specifics of something like machine learning. So I think that's one of the ways, is just to really help everybody feel empowered with what they already know as a contribution to the conversations.
Safiya, right now in your remarks and also in your opening remarks, as well as I was interested how in many of the present opening remarks of the panelists, there was this attention to conversation and voice. So whether that's needing to create spaces to talk for students who might not have those spaces in other classes, or giving voice to people who do not usually participate in these conversations, or who have perspectives which have not historically been written into these conversations. Lise brought up the talking past each other. That sometimes happens from people of different disciplines who would have worked on the same object, but think about it not just in different languages, but also like with different cultures behind them, with different worldviews. Aaron brought up the importance of reasoning, which I imagine is also a big part of that, is putting voice, giving voice to the things that matter, to kind of pulling out what matters in the social to reason about, and how to reason that through conversation. And Rachel, in your remarks about what's the one thing that students will do in response to the course, some of those were actions of doing, others were actions of being able to think and reason, among others, through conversation. So I'm curious in this theme about giving students voice and vocabulary and concepts with which to reason, and reason in communities, and not just reason takes place and conversation takes place among, not just as an individual. I feel like all of your contributions are already, all of your teaching is already creating a possibility of certain kinds of actions and reframings of the problem of ethics in relation to data, just through that kind of making space for voice and bringing voice out. And having observed that, I would like to ask you again to think about what attitudes to the problems of data in the world, and to these modes of human relationships to solving problems that you aspire your students would learn. Like, what is it about the how do you hope that coming out of your classes and your programs, your students will think about the challenges in front of them, whether they are humanists, policymakers, data scientists? How do you hope that the classes will reframe their understanding of the problems? Perhaps that's too big, but it really comes out of the question that Rachel asked about one thing you will do in response to this course. Does it, anyway, if it inspires anything,
yeah.
Feel free to.
No, I would like to say that, I always feel my ultimate goal is to destabilize the idea that technology is just a tool, that it's apolitical, that it's neutral and value-free. That's always in the back of my mind, that if I can help students think that way, they will just ask different questions of their own technical engagements, right? As well as, those who will become designers. And I think of them as a whole person. They will become voters, or they already are voters. They are community members. They are sons and daughters and more. So, I'm trying to, I jokingly tell them that my goal is to make them the most interesting person at a cocktail party. And they love that, and then I'm like, but of course, most of them are too young to care about cocktail parties. I think it's like trying to bring enough humor and levity to very difficult conversations. And then meeting them again with where their interests are. So for example, I really try to have an understanding of who the people are in the room. I've had majors who are actuarial science, for example, and I'll have them read Ta-Nehisi Coates' The Case for Reparations. And they'll say to me things like, Dr. Noble, why do I have to read this? What does the mortgage crisis have to do with actuarial science? And it's like, I'm shocked that they could ask that question. But then when I explain to them what their role will be in modeling data, that they'll probably go work for a big insurance company or Wall Street. And then I explained to them that it was the mortgage crisis that was the facilitated the largest wipeout of Black wealth in the history of the United States. All the wealth gains of Reconstruction, all the wealth gains of the Civil Rights Movement wiped out through the gamification of the financial markets. Because the datafication in fintech really erased the social context of the people and the communities who are the abstraction, as my colleague talked about earlier, right? So we have to recontextualize and rehumanize data and help students understand what abstractions cost us in real terms in society. And so I really appreciate hearing from everyone about, I also look at these kind of real world cases. So I think if they leave the class with their knees a little wobbly and thinking like, whoa, I have never thought of this, but, energized in some way to go forth, then I feel like, we've done the right things in the class. And, that typically is the case. And again, I think that's about our, our own passion that we bring to these conversations. Also, again, for the engineering students, destabilizing the idea that there is an answer, that there is a technical solution, and kind of trying to force them away from that techno-determinism.
Rachel, Aaron, Lisa, would you like to say anything on this, or we can move on to a different question as well?
Yeah, I mean, that was, go ahead.
I was just gonna echo like Safiya's point about abstractions and to my computer science, math, and data science majors, that like data and modeling, right? Their power comes from abstraction and generalization. And I really, what I want my students to come out of my courses being able to do is understand how a statistical snapshot of a data set, does or does not capture the individuals that are actually in the data set. And being able to sort of pull away that abstraction, as needed, and it really is always needed. But yeah, I really did like that point of Safiya's. Rachel.
Oh yeah, no, I thought Safiya's answer was great. I was just also going to bring up that I think a lot of it depends on kind of where students are in their journey, and what their particular background is, what they're going to leave the course from, and something that I realized kind of even just in public speaking several years ago, I would give a talk on algorithmic bias, and then from questions I was realizing, okay, there are people that just don't understand systemic racism at all, and you can't understand algorithmic bias without understanding systemic racism first. And I think there are many topics like that where sometimes people don't even have kind of the background knowledge of the world to make sense of. I found this in my class. This year I was trying to talking about Facebook's role in the genocide in Myanmar, and that a few of the students I think just didn't have enough background even on how genocide works, and what it's not something that just happens overnight, but that how it builds, and what the warning signs are, that so for students, kind of depending on what their base knowledge is and their background knowledge is, I think the goals of the course may be very different. Whereas a student that maybe has more of those pieces is going to end up in a different place. So it is I would say somewhat student dependent what they're going to walk away from it with.
So just a procedural note, I see that we are at an hour and a half since our panel started, but I feel we've only gotten started. So if the panelists are all right with this, I propose we continue until 10:45, and then we can conclude and see if anybody else wants to stick around for 5 more minutes, but 10:45 is kind of still conversation going on. Is that okay with?
That works for me.
Great.
Sure.
All right, and there don't seem to be any questions in the audience. If there are, please, if perhaps I'm not seeing something.
They're in the chat, yeah. There's a number of questions in the chat, there's a few that maybe we could even kind of group together so we can have enough time to address them. There are a few questions in here just about both teaching sort of more mundane aspects of data ethics and how to build that in for people whose job will involve more analytics and modeling, which is something that Debbie Euster asks. And then there's a couple questions just about how to combine, kind of maybe link to that combined technical and ethical education, what kinds of sequences, what kinds of steps, and how you kind of cluster those together. And I think maybe one way of kind of framing these things in relation to maybe one more question is, how do you get started with this? How do you kind of begin teaching HCE or get people to start teaching HCE or taking things like this seriously in your institution? How do you kind of pitch this kind of curriculum? Especially in places, as one question asks, where you don't have the resources, how do you kind of even start approaching this? So that's a kind of little bundle of questions for you to maybe begin considering.
I could say a little bit about weaving them into technical courses because that's something I've done in the past. And so I taught natural language processing last year, and there I somewhat was doing it in a topical way. So when we talked about language generation, I talked about disinformation and kind of what the risks are there, and also kind of just also giving background and kind of important information around how online conversations can be manipulated and how public opinion can be manipulated. And then working in, I also talked about bias and different ways that bias shows up in NLP. So some of it I think is topic dependent. And then for the deep learning course I teach, we do have a big unit on ethics, but also weaving it into other parts as well. So if you can kind of have, examples that you tie back to, because I do think that there is something where it's, it's good to be kind of in a spiral where you are returning to these concepts. But so I would, definitely encourage kind of for any technical course you're teaching to work in the implications, because there are important ethical implications to any of the technical work we do.
I'll just go ahead and jump in and say that, I think no matter the courses we teach, we really try to exercise, the freedom to bring these topics into view. So, I teach a whole range of different kinds of courses. I could be teaching a communications course, a course in African American studies and gender studies and information studies. I've been in media and cinema studies. These are departments I've been in over the course of my career. And I still kind of have the toolkit of things, in terms of, again, lenses and frames that I think are really, of course, there's so much new work out now that's just so brilliant. I can't even teach it all in a quarter. So, and I know my colleagues struggle with this as well. So I think, we have a sequence of 3 courses in the information studies department at UCLA that, kind of starting with my course, IS-10, that's this information and power kinds of course. It's very broad umbrella. I'm trying to teach, again, just ways to cut in. I have to say, I don't typically frame this work around ethics. I try to think much more around, words like justice, because I think that justice allows for a deeper structural analysis. And I think ethics typically puts us in a individual moralistic position, which I teach my students how to recognize that ethics is, let's say, I might teach that ethics is the neoliberal framework, right? That these are all private, personal problems or a matter of our own moral failings or success. But that justice starts to look at histories, social organization, economies, culture, ways of doing the world that we make. And that then allows for, I think, for them to have many more possibilities for intervention, policy interventions, technical interventions, interventions over time that are cumulative, activism, all kinds of, resistance. So I think that those are, again, some ways to think about sequencing. And again, I don't think you have to have new courses. I could teach these ideas in a film course, and I have. So I think it's really about taking the existing courses that you have, if you don't have the resources to make new courses, and try to reimagine them. And a lot of ways you do that is with the Brilliant Scholarship. I know people are putting links into great books that are out right now too. So that would be, I think, just an offering of a way. And then, of course, the pressure we're all under around enrollments. I push back very hard on my courses not growing to, they're proposing this IS-10 to grow to 100 next year. I find that 25 is the sweet spot where people really can be vulnerable about exposing how much they don't know about things like structural racism and being able to kind of experiment. And I push back on the institution and say, look, it's hard to believe we would have a chemistry lab with 100 students and one professor, and that makes sense. And yet this is our lab for talking about and workshopping very important issues that, again, are not unidirectional from me to the students, that require, the same as a dance course or other kinds of courses that are kind of high touch, high impact. So, I do that myself to try to resist or to break into smaller sections, because I think when you're 80 people, you can hide out. And again, I want my students to get their chops. So I tell them, it's like if we were in music performance, you got to perform, you got to play the notes. And so in here, we got to play the notes too. You've got to get your words, you've got to practice, because when you're on the job, you're going to have to make arguments for different kinds of approaches. And you have to use your words to figure out how to do that. You have to write and get good at it. So I think that's another way to think about engagement and how we operate with our institutions to command resources and support to do the high touch, high impact work that I believe is so important for us to be doing.
So I'm not seeing the chat, the questions in the chat for some reason. So Ari, if there's something there that's more pressing than what I asked now, please overwrite it. But I thought, thinking of the audience in mind, I imagine there might be members in the audience who are really, with whom everything we've been talking about really resonates, but perhaps they don't know, where to start. And Ari already asked, I've posed this, but I wonder if we could give, if panelists could give some, really concrete suggestions on how to begin, perhaps even learning about these issues. Well, you might say just reading about them and listening to what others have said, but how to begin kind of putting this, doing this kind of setting up such your own course, whether you already have a course or a new course, to begin to grapple with this in your classes. What advice would you give to someone who is just starting out?
And just to, by the way, just to kind of review, one of the questions was, was asking about suggestions on getting institutional buy-in, which might be one way of framing this question in particular, institutional buy-in for teaching data ethics. And I think that's a really great question. And it's one, by the way, that the following panel on institutional transformation, for people who are going to go to that would be a great place to also ask that question too, because people like Catherine Carson that will be on that panel will also be able to generate more perspectives. But I'd love to hear some things.
Yeah,
here.
I'm happy to kind of chime in a little bit. So first, for the institutional buy-in, I mean, everybody has to realize how fast moving this area is. I mean, the difference in, I don't know, 3 years ago, I was involved in writing some statement by the Computing Research Association and was trying to get in a part about kind of ethics and responsibility. And, we got it in, but it was kind of a new thing versus now, everybody's desperate for it. People understand that there's a problem. So I think this notion of getting institutional buy-in, you may be surprised how supportive even something that 2 years ago, wasn't getting the buy-in now would. I guess Safiya said it eloquently in her history of kind of 10 years ago, people not paying attention versus nowadays, NSF has tons of different programs. Everything has an element connected to this. So I would mainly tell people, I think if you approach your institution, you may well be quite surprised at the support that you will find, and also find that there's a lot of things in your institution. The hardest part is connecting to all of the different people in the different places doing things. And as far as a starting point, Rachel had mentioned this spreadsheet that I don't know if it's easy to put a link to it. I guess someone put a link to the article about it. I mean, that's actually a great resource because it has pointers to so many of the different classes and different settings. So I think there's a fair amount of places to start from now, which again, even 2 or 3 years ago, being in some of the conversations, there was much less.
I would add, I've have not actually yet taught an ethics or an HCE class dedicated just to these topics yet, but I have the way that I've gotten started with it, and I will be teaching one actually this year, and there's a huge amount of demand and support. But the way that I got started with it was just putting it in my own courses, right, that I was already teaching. And primarily a good starting point for me was with examples, right? And really thinking about how I can be thoughtful in the examples that I included in lecture. And that really, approaching it from that perspective, at least, it made it feel like to me that it didn't have to be this huge investment, even if I wanted it to be, right? But that I could get started right away, right? And just include it, as I learned and was comfortable just in my lectures, right? And that sort of small constant exposure really does seem to have like a lot of impact on students. Actually, after the first quarter that I did that and started including sort of relevant topical examples about, like, for example, social justice. In my technical courses, I had students coming up to me and saying that they were inspired to go and take like a sociology classes in the area the next quarter as well, and like learn more about it. And then later when I had them, they would bring it back to the technical courses that I was teaching.
Yeah, I wanted to add one thought about the, okay, I can't tell if things are frozen. If I may, I think one of the challenges right now, honestly, if I can kind of pull back a little bit, like 10,000 feet, is that we are starting to see more resources come at these conversations. I mean, for sure, NSF hosting us in this conversation. I can say that I've personally experienced and witnessed a number of colleagues who, let's say, might be, very critically oriented in terms of using critical theories of power around data science, kind of consistently underfunded or not funded, and let's say the big NSF money or NIH money, and other kinds of resources going to again, like how to build ethical algorithms kinds of work. So I guess one of the things I think we should be doing is pushing back on funding agencies to say, because the universities will follow what the funders are doing. That's what this is, of course, how you get the institutions on board. You're bringing in multi-million-dollar grants. You're going to get to teach whatever you want around these issues. I mean, that's just, we understand the political economy of the universities. So what worries me is when the funding agencies lean toward the kind of techno-solutionism type of work around data ethics and data science. And they're less inclined, maybe their reviewers are not strongly steeped in recognizing other kinds of disciplinary approaches from ethnic studies, from gender studies, and so forth. So what I see is a lot of intense desire for collaboration, cross-campus collaboration. So the engineers will say, somebody go find a social scientist to put on this grant so we look legitimate. Or the social scientists or humanists, got to go find an engineer. And these very difficult pairings that haven't quite been sorted out entirely yet. So I think we just need to be mindful and thoughtful about how money is flowing, what it's flowing toward, and what that can help support at our institutions too.
So that's really a wonderful segue, I think, to the conversations that will take place in the following panel on institutional transformation, because as Safiya says, goodwill and desire to do something is one thing, but doing it in a way that is addressing the long-term structural issues, the people who work on these questions, in other contexts, but whose work is really relevant to the present moment, and responding to the world, including them in a real coherent way so that we can shape the formation of this field of data science and our institutions overall, with this field as part of it, towards something that is truly different and equitable is a real challenge. So, Ari, anything that you'd like to?
Yeah, so I mean, on the one, first, just also thank you so much to all of our panelists for joining us, for putting aside your time and preparation, your expertise, your knowledge, your experience, and sharing that with all of us today. It's been a real pleasure. We were really looking forward to this. I've met a couple of you before, and some of you I'm glad to meet for the first time, and really excited to kind of continue this conversation. And I'd like to invite everyone who's been here as a guest too to don't hesitate to reach out. I can't speak for everyone else, but don't hesitate to reach out to Margot and I for any further tips, questions for resources, ideas about collaborations. It's something we'd really like to find ways to extend and have these conversations in new spaces, create new networks for sharing and collaborating resources and devising really kind of institutional support structures to make these things a reality. So those are my parting words. So yeah, just thank you so much for all your efforts and help.
Yeah, thank you. And we, the panelists, represent a really are anchored in California and of UCs and Bay Areas of vision and role in this. And I hope that we can create something, use this first conversation to create something more, consistent, collaborative altogether, and make interesting curriculum, relevant world of materials for our students to grapple with. So thank you very much, Lisa, Aaron, Rachel, Safiya.
Yeah, thank you for hosting.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
All right, we'll see some of you in the next panel.
Bye.